Does it feel imbalanced in some way if you're without headphones and I have the headphones on?
No. I don't need headphones for validation.
Amanda Sidran.
Hi, Leo.
We're back.
We're back.
I asked you to join me today because some of my regular listeners may have noticed that it's been a little while since I put out an episode.
Has it? Why do you think that is?
Things have been busy.
You don't say.
I figured the best way to just corroborate that story is to bring you in on the conversation.
I'll corroborate for you.
Things have been busy.
Things have been busy. Lots of exciting things happening.
I know. There really have been lots of exciting things. And we'll get to those over time.
And some not so exciting things.
Terribly boring things have been happening also.
Mundane.
Life.
Life is happening as we speak.
All around us.
All around us.
Nonetheless, I did collect a handful of great interviews over the summer that I've been getting around to.
Great.
I'm starting the season off with my conversation with Mary Sweeney.
I know her.
Well, that's why I wanted to have you here also, because Mary is a lovely person. Let me just say this about Mary Sweeney. You and I have a kind of relationship with the idea of Mary Sweeney that goes back before we knew her, right? Because when we were in college in the University of Wisconsin,
yes,
we knew that the filmmaker David Lynch spent his summers in Madison.
Yes, in fact, he often came to a restaurant where I used to work when I was in college.
Slinging steaks.
And
chops.
Supper club.
Right, and so he would come essentially with his wife, with his partner, life partner, Mary Sweeney.
Yes.
The reason he spent time in Madison is because Mary is from Madison.
True.
She was not only his life partner and the mother of their child, they had a child together, but also was his editor and producer and eventually screenwriter. She wrote a film that he directed called The Straight Story.
Yes.
So we knew about Mary. We knew who she was. We kind of knew about her, but we didn't know her personally. And then over time, we've had the privilege of becoming friends with her.
Yes.
So this summer when we were back in Madison, I reached out to her to see if she wanted to get together because she, like us, spends most of her year on a coast. And in her case, it's the West Coast. She lives in L.A. But she spends her summers in Madison like we have been doing over the last few years, spending at least a month in Madison. So I went to her house on the lake. She has this beautiful house that she bought and decorated with David when they were still together.
Yes.
She suggested that we sit outside behind the house in this screened-in porch because she loved all of the natural sounds around her, the sound of the cicadas, the sounds of the birds, the sounds of the cicadas, the sounds of the water, the sounds of the fucking cicadas that I cannot remove from this conversation. And looking back on it, I don't think it was intentional. I mean, I think she knew that they were there. She mentioned it when we sat down. Are these going to be too loud? But when we sat down to talk, the first thing that she said was, she asked me if she could give me some unsolicited advice about my podcast because she'd been listening to it. And she said she feels that I edit it a little too tightly.
She would know.
This is coming from a world-class editor, film editor.
How did that make you feel, Leo?
I felt flattered that she had listened and had provoked any opinion in her at all.
That's good.
I appreciated the feedback, and I know what she was talking about. As a matter of fact, that commentary kind of set us off. What does this mean to us today? It means that the conversation is intermittently ambushed by the Wisconsin cicada community.
I think that would be lovely.
It is nice.
Could be worse. You've had your interviews interrupted by sirens, motorcycles, poodles. Cicadas don't sound so bad.
All things considered, it's not so bad. The other thing is, I took her advice and I left this one a little
loose,
little looser. As you know, I think you know what she's talking about because you often walk through the room when I'm editing these things and say to me, "Boy, what a ridiculous job you have removing ahs and ums and hums and buzzes." And, I mean, I get forensic with this stuff.
You really do. It's time consuming.
You got that right. So that's why I took her advice to heart. And so my conversation with Mary Sweeney and the cicadas is what follows. Of course, we know that there's a little bit of housekeeping that we have to do.
Always.
You want to get it started or should I?
I'd be happy to get it started. If you would like to listen to this interview and are so inspired to look for more of the same, perhaps the conversation with
Mark Webb, the film director, also from Madison.
or
Lori Moore,
the prolific author, also from Madison. You may find these at third-story.com, where you can find all of the conversations that Leo has had over his many years of recording this podcast. And if you are so inclined, you may also maybe throw $1 or $2 a month his way in order to maintain the momentum that the Third Story has taken on. And if you would like to do that, you can go to patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast.
by the way, David Lynch found much of his financing overseas. As I learned in this conversation with Mary Sweeney, many of his films were produced in collaboration with French production companies. I don't want the patrons of the Third Story to feel limited by U.S. currency.
Nor by oceans.
Or by geography. That's exactly right. So we will be accepting all forms of currency, and you can listen from any corner of the planet. We welcome you.
Welcome. Bienvenidos.
Bienvenue.
Willkommen.
Shalom. Without further ado, Amanda Sidran, always such a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Leo.
Here's my conversation with the wonderful Mary Sweeney. So this is my style, and also I edit the stuff.
I noticed that listening to Lori's thing. You edit it pretty heavily.
Could you hear the edits?
I can.
I'm just curious. Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
Because I'm like used to ADR,
Yes.
and it's like I'm hypersensitive to sound and editing. I do have a suggestion.
I want to hear
Very
it.
cheeky of me.
I want to hear it.
But it is in part because I've edited, so much sound.
Yes.
That's either off camera or, things like that, or radio tracks that you're, just sort of building things, that I wish you left more air. You're really trying to obviously maximize the amount of the interview in the amount of time that you want. But I need some air in between stuff a little bit. And also I think that really makes it obvious that you're topping and tailing things.
I saw in this panel interview that you did at the Madison reunion, that you started out as an audio editor, or that you were doing audio editing?
I actually started out as a sound apprentice.
So
Yes.
What is that?
Well, there's sound editors in feature film,
Yes.
and there are picture editors, and there are many more sound editors than there are picture editors. Usually, there was one picture editor,
Right.
their assistant, their apprentice.
Right.
And then there'd be 10 sound editors, effects, dialogue,
Right.
Foley, music, and they all had their assistants, and there were a team of apprentices, and it was very stratified. It was a union job in features, and very clearly defined responsibilities for editors, assistant editors, and apprentices. So it was easier to get work, consequently, in sound editing, because there were more jobs. And to get work as a picture editor was very, very difficult back in the days when it was film, because you had no opportunities like now. Anybody can edit. They can learn by themselves, and they all learn by themselves now. But you couldn't literally get a chance to cut anything. A 35 millimeter. If you're an apprentice or an assistant even, you're not going to cut anything. Only the editor's cutting. So how do you get experience? It was really difficult in those days. And since there were so few editors and so few apprentices and assistants, it was just really hard to even get one of those jobs.
Get your hands on a
35 millimeter film and the guillotine cutter and the tape and the whole thing. It was a long time.
What I think is happening in my editing of these episodes is that I am trying to cover for something. I think that I'm a heavy-handed editor because I'm trying, as you say, I'm trying to make it go quick. That's definitely one thing. I'm afraid I'm going to lose them if I.
Right.
But I also think that if you look at what I edit, I probably edit 70% of myself out. Mm-hmm. And 25-30% of the other people. Uh-huh. So I know that I'm kind of protecting myself in my editing.
Yeah, I know how that goes.
And it strikes me that it would take an editor to recognize that and hearing that.
And also, I'm a film editor, so I edit picture and sound. And in the case of working with David, he very jealously guards the responsibility of designing sound. So I don't really get to do too much while I'm, editing the film with the sound. But I am very sensitive to performance, basically, and to cadence. And you're a musician, so you know what I'm saying. It's just there has to be a flow, a fast and slow, and a pause, both in picture and sound, to allow time for the spectator or the listener to digest and to sort of project their own thoughts into. And that's the thing that holds people in. It's not speed. I mean, action movies are a great example of, they're really boring. They have no fast and slow and no kind of ebb and flow like a symphony. They kind of, it's, like one action sequence, a little bit of bullshit business in between, followed by another action sequence. And the action sequences are phenomenal, but it's a diet that is doesn't have any traction with the consumer, with the audience, whatever it is. And so, I think that if one just pauses, both the speaker, your guest, or yourself, at a point where something's making you think, your audience is going to be thinking too, and you give them the freedom, the time to do that without it rushing into something else.
And the respect to give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll hang on long enough there. Now, I will say I have also interviewed quite a few older people who are so slow that I find I just have to do you this favor and just tighten it up a little bit.
That's a different thing.
But I think something that's emerging here is that editing is rhythmic, that there's rhythm in editing.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's in many ways a very musical thing to do. And it seems to me that as an editor, you kind of have an innate rhythm or sense of rhythm.
Yeah.
Is that something that you have to find? Is that something that you develop?
I think that there are people who have an innate sense of rhythm and they become many things based on that. Athletes, musicians, film editors, and I just was lucky enough to have, at NYU grad school, I was in the cinema studies division, not in the production division. But in the summer...
That's film theory, isn't it?
Yes, but in the summer I took the productions kind of intro course called Sight and Sound, where you team up with 3 other people and you rotate responsibilities. And it's because it's in the summer, you're working every day. It's shortened and it's 5 days a week. And so, we were making films and being directors, actors, writers, editors, and with Bolexes and 16 millimeter upright moviolas, editing machines. I instantly recognized something that just tapped into my curiosity, my ability, my instincts, my intuition. It all just like turned on in about 5-button ways when I was, editing on this crappy upright. And those films were terrible the editing was terrible on those films that I made. But it just sang to me, basically. I loved, when it was film, I loved the math. I loved the tactile experience of working with film and, winding it into a machine that was like a harvester and, standing up physically, working these. I mean, there were so many things about it that just suited me in a variety of ways, and I just never looked back. And so I kept going with that. The more experienced I got, it's only really, and still, I make certain discoveries about what editing meant to me. And I haven't really been editing except for myself in a decade, but that I was able to understand that sense of rhythm and in me and as an essential part of that skill set. And the fact that a 2-hour movie is like writing a symphony to me when you're editing it, and each scene is like a small piece of music, and when you put them together they don't always work well together, and it's so you make a scene work in a musical way, and then you hook them up according to the script, and then you have to make it work as a full piece. It's a beautiful thing about editing, and I know that you do when you write music and when you do these shows. This is when you change one thing, everything around it changes. So it's a perpetual. I mean, I'll see things I've edited, and I'm generally satisfied, but I'm looking at things I wish I had changed.
You still, even years later, you can watch something from 15, 20, 30 years ago and say, ugh.
I don't cringe exactly. I just think, oh, if only I'd had a little more time, I could have finessed that. It's nothing, I really do work in, editing film especially was so labor intensive.
Yes.
Long hours alone in a dark room. Many, I definitely hit the 10,000 hour rule of outliers on the editing front. I really just kept going. But there's just like every there's hundreds of cuts. Every cut is an opportunity to make it better. It's crazy.
I think I remember you telling me once that of all of the editing and all of the films that you did, you cut one thing digital, or you cut one thing in a non-linear way?
All the way up through Lost Highway, which was about 1997, we edited on film. And Lost Highway, because I was also producing, I budgeted for both a digital finish and a film finish. And we were shooting on film. It was just too early in the game. And all the people in the labs really would, be so much happier if they didn't have to go to digital inner negatives and all this kind of business. And they weren't really comfortable with frame rates then. And also in sound, if you don't have the locked-in mag, which will phase to tell you whether you're in sync or not, it's just numbers, and there's no true sync anymore. As long as it's digital, there's no true sync. There's no way of getting, that I know of. I'm sure there is, but when we switched to digital mixing on Lost Highway, and I would, just as I could see it, I'd say, I think you're about 2 frames out of 2 sprockets of a 4-sprocket frame. I think you're about a half a frame out of sync. And they couldn't check it. And when we used to do it analog, you could check it. You could go back and line it up and hear it phasing. It's like, you're right, it was out of sync. So I started using Avid around that time. That's why we were thinking about it, because David and I used to make commercials in between features, because there were big gaps in time sometimes between features. And I started cutting those on Avid just to sort of get myself up to speed on that technology. And that was a good thing to do. And then when we did Mulholland Drive, right on the heels of... No, sorry, The Straight Story was the first time I used Avid to edit. So Lost Highway was the last film, all-film edit.
And did you feel like you became a different kind of person, different editor? Did you have to change in order to accommodate that?
No, I just bent the technology to serve, and it was a great way to do it, because there are really painfully labor-intensive parts of film editing with film, and namely cutting the dailies into the scenes and just accessing in a non-linear way, or linear way, accessing the reels and reels of film and the number of chems you have in a room that still are not enough to make that easy. You're always having to take 1,000-foot reels on and off to check continuity.
Just to see what happened.
To see what happened, and to go to a different close-up, or to go to a close-up where the cigarette's the same length as what you've now cut into the wide shot, all that kind of stuff. Really labor-intensive. That part was like beautiful. I felt like I was flying, because I could just instantly access all of the dailies. That was great. But I always used digital editing, and I still use digital editing in using the habits I have as a film editor. And they wrote, all of the software was to wean film editors off of film. So you'd have bins instead of files and things like that. Now, though, and for a while now, there is an entirely different generation of editors. And the people who are attracted to film editing now are different from the people because it's missing that mechanical, mathematical, tactile, very slow, and very patient. You had to be really patient as a film editor, and you had to really be excruciatingly observant so that you wouldn't have to go back and check things, and also take copious notes on every day's dailies and things like that. And you really were intensely focused. And now it's quite the opposite. You can change everything 17 times in about 3 minutes.
Sure.
And you get very, very far away from your first impression of how that footage affected you very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I had always thought that MTV sped everything up, but the technology itself changes the way, the expectation of how quickly things need to change, right? Like you can cut much faster, and you can change things much faster.
And you are sort of less tethered to what was meaningful to you about, especially with someone like David, whose footage is so painterly. I could just swim. I'd get these dailies, and I would just, it's like Christmas every day. And I would just immerse myself, I'd just be lost to the world, and I would immerse myself in these dailies. But I was also really taking copious notes, because they'll never affect you that way. The second time is already, it's like the first time you see it is when you get the hair raising on your arms. It's like, oh my God, look at the way that light is moving across her face. Things like that. And that's all gold, and that gets lost. I mean, I bet there are definitely people who do not even watch their dailies in real time, and you just lose all that magic.
You've mentioned David David Lynch
As
several
in
times
David
already.
Lynch, yeah.
It occurs to me that your development as an editor really takes place in collaboration with David Lynch.
Yes. I went from being an assistant to an associate. I associate edited, again, because of the nature of the business. It was almost a decade before I actually got to cut even a scene. Yeah, it's a tough profession, but I loved it. And very early on, I was an associate editor on a documentary, and that gave me the bug right away that I should just hang in there. But I worked primarily in features, and that's really difficult to move up. And through a very lucky break, I was living in the Bay Area, and David brought Blue Velvet to the Bay Area for post-production because Alan Splett, his sound designer, was from the Bay Area, and he wanted to go home. He wanted to work from home. And I got hired as the assistant editor on that, and through, again, a very lucky break. But I was
As I understand it, the lucky break is that the assistant editor who would have done it left for a great opportunity to edit Howard the Duck.
To be an assistant editor on Howard the Duck, yeah. So I got the booby prize of working on Blue Velvet.
Which changed your life.
Totally changed my life, yeah. And so I was assistant editor on Blue Velvet and first assistant on Wild at Heart. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. for 3 years.
For what reason?
I was married to someone who was in law school in Berkeley. That's why we were there. And he had some clerkships in Washington, D.C., so we moved there for 3 years. And so that's when they made the pilot of Twin Peaks. And I came back to work as the assistant editor on Wild at Heart. I came back to L.A. to work on that. And
you moved back, or you just went back for that project?
I went back for that project, but that was a point at which my husband and I decided to get divorced. And my moving out there was part of that sort of trial separation. I then was hired as what they called a swing editor on the Twin Peaks first season, I forget. I guess it must have been the first season.
That's a kind of significant difference, though, right? Because there was so much tone in that show.
Yeah.
The difference between coming in the first season and the second season would have been really different.
I think the first season was while I was on Wild at Heart. I think that's why I wasn't on the first season. And then I was hired as a swing editor on the second season. That was that perfect, very hard to find opportunity to learn how to cut in film, because they were doing the first season and the second season in film, 35 millimeter film. They shot and cut it in film. So there were 3 editors, and they would throw these simple scenes at me, because they were working on an unbelievably fast schedule. And I was just like the cleanup man. I was getting scenes, and increasingly complicated scenes, from each of them to, keep them on schedule. And it was fantastic.
And you had already worked on 2 of David's films at that point.
Yeah, Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart.
Was it helpful having worked on those films when you walked into the show to kind of get a sense of what the values are or how he might think about things, or it wasn't like that?
Well, when I walked into that show and the scenes I was getting were not really even if I had acclimated to David's style, it didn't make any difference. It's sort of like you're still at the stage where you're buying people cigarettes and coffee a little bit, but not completely, but so I definitely by that point, David and I were friends. We were good friends, but I also had been gone for 3 years, and I, learned so much from the 3 editors who were giving me these scenes. I mean, that's a really great thing that also isn't there anymore, because everybody's an autodidact on digital editing now. They start making movies when they're in 6th grade and just making it up. And it's great in a lot of ways. It's very inventive, but it's also, I learned a lot from editors. I learned a lot from Duane Dunham, who edited Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart. And I learned a lot from these 3 editors I worked with. And then what happened was Duane Dunham moved into directing on the second season. He directed 2 or 3 episodes of Twin Peaks in the second season. And so he wasn't available to edit episode 7, which David was directing, which is the episode that revealed the murder of Laura Palmer. And David asked me to edit it for him. And I'd fortunately been on a very fast curve learning how to edit. And, I had a lot of sensibility just from osmosis of sitting behind editors, watching them edit, especially Duane, for years by that point. And that was fantastic. I love that episode. And also that episode had a very important scene at the end of it, which is the murder scene. And it's intercut with the scene in the bar of all the central characters who are sort of feeling out of the ether this horrifying thing that's happening. The giant is there saying, it is happening, all that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of scene where that was a totally musical kind of experience. And I was, drunk in love with the opportunity to cut a scene like that with those characters and with that footage and with David's kind of spiritual, really, sensibility about certain things. And that kind of sealed the deal.
Yes.
I was really well suited to edit for David.
Yes.
That was totally, as you were saying at the beginning of this, my own sense of rhythm added to what I'm curious about, what I need, what I don't need. I don't need answers. I'm not really meticulous in a way that a lot of editors are in that kind of, way. I mean, a very meticulous, you have to be in the operation of the machines and, all that. But I don't need him to explain anything to me.
Well, that's my sense of it in previous conversations that we've had, that I think people walk away from David's work often wondering what it meant. And the idea that even those most intimately involved in the production of the thing might not entirely know, it didn't matter to you to know what it meant always.
No, I was along for the ride. I didn't need to know, because this is the thing about David's films, and it's not only from those of us, and actors say this all the time.
Yeah.
I didn't really know what it meant, but I just talked to David.
Yeah.
And you don't get explanations. Even if you talk to him about it, you don't get explanations. And David and I had a very nonverbal relationship when it came to the work. I didn't need answers, and he knew I didn't. And, I had a script. He would shoot a script. Then I'd get these dailies, and I could, cut them according to the script.
Yeah.
And what did he need to say? It was there. But that's what's great about his films, especially Mulholland Drive, and the effect they have on audiences. You don't really know what the hell's going on, and you work really hard in a fun way to make sense of it that makes sense to you.
It's interesting. I saw an interview with David around the promotion of Mulholland Drive where he seemed to talk about everything in very emotive terms. Mm-hmm. It's a feeling.
Yeah.
The Mulholland Drive gives you a feeling.
Mm-hmm. It's a smell. It's a little wind.
Yeah.
It's the sound of a,
And it really helped me in a lot of ways understand that this is some kind of an attempt to access a deep sensibility, emotion, that's what was driving him. Mm-hmm. That was helpful because you are sort of left trying to unpack all of this.
Right. But at the same time, it's pretty entertaining.
Yes. So you used an expression, Mary, when you were cutting that episode of Twin Peaks where you said I was drunk in love with the whole work, but or you didn't say with what exactly. You said I was drunk in love. I can't help but think, is that when you fell in love with David Lynch? Is that when you came together? Because
I am definitely not going to give that a timeline.
Well, you don't have to give it a timeline, but it does need to, I think it needs to sort of be explored at least that you had a personal relationship that was kind of going on.
No, that's quite obvious. We have a 26-year-old son.
Yes.
And there's no denying it.
Yes, right. There's evidence.
Caught.
Yes.
David and I, from the get-go, got along like Ike and Mike. But it was many years before it advanced to anything else because I was married and I was committed to my marriage.
Right.
And he had just gotten involved with Isabella, and he was still married when I first met him. He was married to his second wife, and he was just coming off the shoot of Blue Velvet. And their relationship lasted many years. And all during that time, David and I, like I said, got along so great. But I was an apprentice, and he was the director, and we got along really great in post-production on Blue Velvet, but I was also, he was very close to Dwayne, and that's who he was working with. And I had my hands full because I was the only assistant on that job. And, but we just, we got along great. I ended up I'd have to drive him to screenings and things like that. But, for David, he's kind of linear in his relationships. Every one of them are distinct, and he's focused on them when he's in them. I, was very focused on my marriage and making it work because obviously it wasn't working. So it was a long time before it moved from just a friendship, but we did get along really well from the beginning. But there was, 3 years when I wasn't on the West Coast at all. So.
Right. But there's something symbiotic about that relationship at a certain point. It seems to me like almost everything you cut was for David.
I mean, I worked for David for 20 years.
Yeah.
I didn't work for anybody but David for 20 years.
Right.
And I worked on a lot of really interesting films before that,
Yeah.
and, good feature films. But again, I was working my way up through the, very slow ranks.
And you became his producer as well.
Yes, I became his producer, and then I wrote The Straight Story. And so it was a very integrated life, and it was a really fantastic life. He's got a compound in the Hollywood Hills where he's got a mixing stage, 5.1 mixing stage. That wasn't in the beginning. That came with Lost Highway. So we had that for Lost Highway and The Straight Story and Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire. We were able to mix in our own facility. And we lived there, we raised Riley there, and I had an editing suite, I had a painting studio, he had a woodworking shop, he had a painting studio. It was just like a creative, hive. It was so fantastic. So yeah, we were integrated in many ways, and it all was, I say, fairly Fred and Ginger for many, many years. We were really in a great lockstep. He was leading, he was the director, I was the editor or producer or writer. And it was a, fantastic pleasure to work with him in that way. And I was very deeply involved on all levels. He was my husband. We had a child, and I took care of my child. I took care of my husband, and I edited, and I, produced and wrote.
It's interesting that you say it was kind of a nonverbal relationship, right? Like all of that you're doing without having too much discussion about.
It just depended. I was really referring to the creative collaboration of editing and directing when I said that, because I didn't need explanations.
Yeah.
I use the example all the time. When I read in the script of Mulholland Drive that 2 little old people are going to go under the door jamb, I don't need to ask him about that, because guess what? I'm going to see that in dailies, and I can't wait to see it. Mm-hmm. It's so much more fun to see what that's going to mean.
Yes.
When I'm reading it in the script. Also, I was cutting the first cut while he was shooting, and there was very little time to talk about stuff. We always talk. I talked to him every morning. I would call him as soon as I'd seen the dailies.
But when you're setting a production of a film and he's got a script and a concept,
right,
and you have to, as you say, I budgeted this, something as simple as, well, we budgeted to do it digitally and on film. Like how? I guess maybe one of the questions is, tell me about the process of producing a film. And tell me about being in close collaboration with the writer-director while that's happening.
That sort of grew out of the fact that I was always taking care of David effectively. And so in post-production, when I would lock picture and turn it over to sound, I would remain engaged in, discussing with him distribution deals. If we were looking for distribution or what festivals to go to and all that kind of stuff. We were very engaged in a team in taking care of the child that was, besides a real child, the film, whatever film we were working on. Often producers aren't that attentive at the tail end. They're onto other things. There are so many different kinds of producers. It just sort of emerged that I was actually paying attention to a lot of things that were outside the scope of being an editor, and David trusted me, and, again, we just got along. We understood each other very well, and, his creative rights and protecting his creative rights through everything, including, distribution and marketing and all those things, were something I was very engaged in because it was beneficial to everybody associated with the film, and especially David. So that sort of is how I, started talking to him about producing, and so I produced a small film called Nadja first, and then after that I started producing on Lost Highway, which is right on the heels of Nadja, and I produced everything through Inland Empire after that. It just became a general, we were just partners in my sort of interfacing in ways that he really wanted me to. It wasn't that I was actually wanting to, but I sort of became a shield, I think, in a lot of ways, where I could interface between him. Also, we were always financed by French companies, and I speak French, and I'd lived in Paris, and so I started working with French financiers, and that really helped that too. And we spent a lot of time in France, and David still goes to France regularly, but we were always taking films to the Cannes Film Festival. We were going for meetings with our financiers, and, for two kind of Midwestern people, it's an odd intersection, and it was a very harmonious intersection that we had.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I see that there's always a French...
Yeah, Studio Canal and CB 2000 and...
And yet the films don't feel particularly French to me.
No, They're very American, but
Yes.
the Europeans love David's film. They don't feel American to them at all. They're
Yeah.
they're both very American because he's part like Jimmy Stewart and part someone totally avant-garde.
Yes.
And they love that in
Yes.
France. They love him like they love Jerry Lewis. He's a very big deal over there.
Or Woody Allen.
I think they love him more than Woody Allen.
They love him more than Woody Allen. As a musician and as a composer, I really am curious about working with really the same composer on so many projects as well. Angelo did so many of those projects.
Yeah.
At what phase would the music enter the process, and how, as an editor, do you interface with that?
Angelo and David have a really beautiful and, again, very nonverbal, spiritual and emotional bond. And, again, they were a very, they intersected in some very special way, just like creatively David and I did, different from the way it was with Angelo. And it had nothing to do with my personal relationship with David, because it was there before that developed. And it has to do with music. David he doesn't play anything, which he would probably take umbrage with, but he has a very incredible gift for hearing music and marrying music to images and knowing when it's right. And he began, once he had his own mixing stage, which started, again, with Lost Highway, he began running the music mix, running all the pots on the board, on the big board.
David would mix.
Yeah. And he slows it down, he reverses it, he marries things. So what he would demand of Angelo was really more abstract, less scripted or scored to picture. That Angelo definitely did that, especially with things like The Straight Story. He scored to picture and did so beautifully. He's such a gifted musician. I mean, that kind of range of from Blue Velvet to Straight Story to Mulholland Drive and the music he did for those things. So they would do things like, they just have these sessions, which David loved. He would go to New York, and Angelo worked with this engineer, Artie, in some shithole building on the west side of Manhattan, and the three of them would get together. there was so much jerry-rigged stuff in that studio. And Artie could do anything Angelo asked him for. He was an amazing engineer. And they would just sit in this thing for days, and they weren't really working around a picture or anything, and they would just come up with things. And David, would use them for commercials and shorter things. And Angelo just kept like a briefcase of stuff that they, did. And he'd pull them out. He'd say, what about that? And David so I think that when they went to, for example, start working on the score of Mulholland Drive, which was initially for a TV pilot, I think they actually pulled out something they had written specifically for a Mulholland Drive feeling years before. Because Mulholland Drive was an idea that David had at the end of Twin Peaks, the original Twin Peaks, that he and Mark Frost were going to do another series, and they gave it a title, Mulholland Drive, and it was going to be about the girls from Twin Peaks coming to Los Angeles, to Hollywood. So I think at some point he and Angelo just created a kind of what the feeling David had about that idea was, and he actually pulled it out. I think it's maybe the opening credit sequence. But that sort of also shows you how much my involvement was in it, which is fairly tangential.
Yes.
And I rarely cut to music, only when there's like playback, like a Rebecca Del Rio in Yolanda, the crying thing in Mulholland Drive, because I like the scene to work and have its own music coming out of the scene.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
So you just cut according to a biorhythm, like essentially...
My own biorhythm, yeah. I cut everything. I cut the first cut without David in the room. And then he would come in, and we would sit down and watch it. The first cuts would be very, very long. We'd sit down, put it on a flatbed initially, and just watch it reel after reel.
Would you build in a little extra space knowing that it might tighten up, or they'd be long because that's how you...
I was it was a very rough assembly. And I always... I was pretty negligent about trying to make it work, honestly. First of all, I wanted to put in every single... preference that he had circled, among the takes. Even if it wasn't really working, I didn't think it was the best, it would be a disservice to not show him.
And his preferences are coming from watching dailies or from being on set?
No, not really. It's what it's what he'll say. That's the best take. Yeah, and the continuity person will, script supervisor will circle that. And
so that's how he would work. He would just watch the performances, and he would say in the moment, I think this is the one.
Yeah, he wouldn't watch the performance. Nobody had playback in those days. He'd watch it with his eye, right? And he would know. He's unbelievably sharp about things. So, for example, if I didn't use his preference and he wouldn't have the thing in front of him and said that was a circle preference, he'd say, why didn't you use my preference? So it was, it was in my interest to show him everything that he thought was the best in the first cut, no matter how lumpy and bumpy it was, because that would save us time going back in, at a very late stage and saying, that wasn't my preferred take. Why is that in there? I don't like it anymore, this kind of stuff. Whatever. There are a variety of reasons. But I was out of respect also to his intentions and to keep it raw enough that we could start to give it shape from that point. And so
obviously there's no music at that point because there's no way that you could try to cut
definitely no, but as I'm saying these things, I think it's an interesting thing. I really was kind of, it was an egoless position to take. It wasn't about what I thought would be the best cut at that point. It was about showing him, each scene plotted out the way he set it up. He would shoot masters that were like a full 1,000-foot reel, 10 minutes long of the whole scene. So I would just take a master and build in, close-ups and two shots where he shot them. And so, it was always running very long, and it was really very rough. But it gave him the opportunity to not have someone else have given it a shape before he was in the cutting room.
Do you think that is common for editors to do?
I have no idea what editors do. We're all in our own little caves. I mean, I know that's not what Dwayne does. Dwayne would always really fine cut it. It was like he couldn't stand it being that rough. It was too painful for him. And it was painful. I mean, David, it is a very difficult moment for directors when they come into the cutting room and all of their dreams and the infinite possibilities that they had when they went into shooting something are gone. And there's nothing but the meat and potatoes that they have in front of them and they want to blow their brains out. And the rougher the cut, the bigger the gun.
Part of me thinks it's very nurturing to do that, or very sensitive to just say, I'm going to give you the opportunity to shape it without imposing my ego. Of course, that's me sort of attempting to frame you as a non-typical editor, and this relationship being, kind of wrapped up in, even though you weren't together the whole time that you were working with him, but that you had this feeling for him that you wanted to let him do it.
Yeah, you're going there. I mean, I
don't know.
I understand. Look, I'm not going to deny I was crazy in love with David, but that was separate from crazy in love with his artistry. I mean, I really, I didn't separate him. That's the beautiful thing about that 20-year ride. They were, after a certain point, totally integrated and beautiful. And, it fed into, our family and, his kids from his other marriage. And it was like a very beautiful time. But I admire I was in awe of David's artistry and his discipline. Yeah. And, everything from like, where is he getting those crazy ideas? Where is that kind of feeling that he's getting into this stuff coming from to, how can he remember what his preferred take was and that I didn't use it,
Well, and so to an extent that opens up the question of, and I think we talked about this last time I saw you, of just what it does to you, what it is like to be in the service of somebody,
I hate that term.
Not in the service as a servant, but that is to be serving of the vision, to be part of the vision of somebody.
Well, that's a question you can ask me and Angelo and Peter Deming and Naomi Watts. But it's a gift.
It's a gift.
It's a gift to him and it's a gift to us.
Yes.
And it's a collaborative process. But when I just finished working on the Romanoffs with Matt Weiner, and he is also an extremely smart guy.
Totally. Well, and that's why the question.
And I don't feel in service to Matt, but I feel really happy to be working for someone who's so good at what they do.
That's where I'm going. This is not so much about David as it is about you, and it is about being around that kind of creative. That there are some people who are vibrating differently.
Yeah. There are some people who are vibrating differently, but I'm going to take the lens off of those, famous people for a moment and talk about people like me and all of the other people who support. Like Angelo is another good example. It's like each of us, I would say, when we work with people like that, we have to have a certain level of our own creative sensitivity and ability and insight and gifts to play up to that game, and our game is really raised by the talent we're supporting and collaborating with. So I'd like to think of it more as collaboration than in service to. I think that there are people like me, and I would say, again, Angelo, but, the film business and television business are full of so many talented people. Jack Fisk is another one, who have enormous talent, but they aren't great directors. And they can bring their talents to the table for great directors, and great directors continue to work repeatedly with people who play up to their game and bring their own gifts and a sensibility that's compatible with theirs.
Well, this is the thing, right? Like, in so many of these instances, you and Angelo and David is a good one. There's obviously enormous benefit to finding your team and your people and staying there because you allowed him to do what he needed to do.
Enabled him. What would David's films be like without Angelo's music or my editing or Peter Deming's DP, Jack Fisk's art production? David found people who understood his vision and could give him what he wanted.
Yes.
And those kinds of directors hang on to those people.
Yes. Eventually, David directed a film that you wrote, The Straight Story.
Yeah.
I read something where he said he thought it was his most experimental film, which is
and
funny.
The most abstract film, I think he said, was another thing he said about it. It's very hard to make a slow movie like that. And I think that's what he was referring to.
Yes.
And we really struggled. It was like a very, it was an interesting edit because, it was a slow motion old fart road movie and not much happened. But it was a beautiful film.
What was it like for you now to be cutting something that you wrote where you walked into the process with, you must have had something in your head when you wrote it, some visual idea.
Yeah, oh no, it meant a lot to me. That's why I wrote it. I didn't want to trust it to anyone else to write. By the time I finally got the rights, which took me 4 years, I didn't trust it to anybody else to write it.
So the rights took you 4 years. As I understand the timeline, the story itself only took place not that long before.
I think it was like 95 or something like that, 94, 95.
So did you read about it or hear about it?
I read about it, and it was like it was on NPR, it was in the newspapers, and I...
Guy drove his tractor across the state line. Yeah, it really
caught my imagination. Is this part of the country? It's the kind of, I've said this many times, these kind of, you know them too, these kind of laconic Midwesterners, especially in the northern Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin, very yep, nope kind of, thing, but also wise, very wise and smart and just not well-educated rural people. And I loved the character. I loved his stubborn pride, the reasons why he drove his lawnmower 350 miles and the kind of ingenuity of it and the stubbornness and the dignity really attracted me. So it took me a long time to get the rights. And then I wrote it and with my childhood friend here, John Roach. And when I gave it to David...
Did you think maybe David would be interested in it?
It was a little bit of a cat and mouse thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew that, places which you'd mentioned beforehand, where our sensibilities from our childhood intersected, that there was a lot of, and you see in Twin Peaks, kind of quirky small town stuff that was so funny to me and was pretty sure he would think was funny, but I wasn't really ever hoping he would do it. It seemed like such an absurd idea that he would do it. He would encourage me to pursue the project, and he kind of thought it was a funny idea, but he, many times would say, it's not my cup of tea. And then he read the script, and he fell in love with the script. And then it happened super fast. I mean, he read the script in June of 98, and the fact that David wanted to make that film, anybody who was nervous, who admired David's work but was nervous about actually financing something of his, got unnervous very fast. So we had 5 or 6 companies competing, and it was very low budget. It was like $8 million to finance it. And we went with this French company, Studio Canal, and we were shooting in August, 2 months later. 2 months after he read the script, we were shooting at the end of August. It was fantastic.
Wow.
It never happens that way. It was really great.
That's an interesting thing that you say, that it's difficult to make a slow film. And that maybe, in that sense, that's what he's referring to. But it's also a very linear story. I mean, it just plays out. And I was thinking, like, for somebody that has been filling his career with these kind of mysterious questions, does this mean something? Does this not? Does this character coming back? Is this, why did that happen? This is just a very linear story.
Well, it is once I started producing for David, and long before I was actually producing for him, he would get scripts from his agents and he would have me read them. I was like his, personal development person. And I was always looking for something that harkened back to the kind of what I call David's Irish lyrical soulfulness that we saw in Elephant Man. Mm-hmm. And so that is a very linear movie. Mm-hmm. And Straight Story is not, The Elephant Man, which is such a beautiful film. But it has that similarity. It's very lyrical. Mm-hmm. It's very emotional, but not sentimental. Deeply emotional and not sentimental. And it's very universal, and it's very linear. And it just came in a much, different package. I tried to get him to direct All the Pretty Horses. I was really working hard to get somebody to, see the wisdom of my insight on this and join me in convincing David, because he wasn't going to do it just because I said he should. Au contraire. And so I just couldn't get anybody on board. He would have made a beautiful version of that. And that could have been a little bit sort of grander, like Elephant Man. But it was very much the more conscious David than the unconscious David. Yeah. So it didn't seem odd to me. I was really happy, and I was glad that the script had moved him. And it was an emotional response that he had that made him want to do it. And everybody was very supportive, unlike the idea of All the Pretty Horses. He, his agents, his managers, his lawyers, everybody was like, yeah, you got to make this, So everything was very, very supportive, great supportive nature for the project. And I'm really glad he did, because it could easily, in the hands of a different director, turned into kind of smarmy something. But
when you went to cut that, you talk about reading David's scripts and then cutting what's on the page.
Right.
But in this case, it's your page that you're cutting.
And it's like you were saying earlier, you get the opportunity to save yourself. It's like you get to cut out all the stupid things you've said, the dumb questions you asked. I'm sure you never ask a dumb question.
Many.
But that's what it was like. Because by that point, I'd been editing for 20-some years, in the profession. And I was really happy for the opportunity to shape it into a movie that worked. Yes. And we lost whole scenes, and, there were certain scenes, like the beautiful scene in the bar of the two war veterans, and he's telling that story about, killing the sniper. Very emotional, and both of the actors got very emotional. Like Wiley Harker, the guy that Richard Farnsworth was there with, such a beautiful old actor, but he was actually really having a hard time controlling himself. He was so moved by the scene, and he was really almost sobbing, and it was too much. It was not insincere. He wasn't overacting. It was kind of something opened up in him, like a wound, and I really had to cut back on that to keep a balance. So I had the opportunity of making sure that, according to the intention, had been written in, which is it wasn't going to be sentimental. It was going to be something resonant, but not sappy. And I had, every opportunity to stay on that beam, and David kept it there too.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I talk about over-editing or editing myself out, what I do think is that if I had, in the case of this podcast, let's say, an editor who could say, it's actually fine.
Yeah.
I understand why you want to kind of chisel your features a little bit, but it's just show yourself as you are.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I think, why I over-edit sometimes. What you're describing is more making sure that the tone is true to what the script is, because...
Or that the picture works. That's the thing an editor does, is you just got to try to make that 2-hour experience. Yeah. You don't want anybody to be looking at their watch or squirming in their seat. You want to just make sure you don't lose anybody at any moment, and that the picture is always working. And that's... took precedence over, oh, geez, that was a favorite line I wrote. I don't even remember having a moment like that. It was just opportunities, it seemed to me, to make it shine more than my script did.
Yes. I will forever remember from this conversation right now this thing that you said to me at the beginning, which is that people are pulled in or compelled by space, not by speed, that they need time to reflect and put themselves in.
That sensibility in myself was really so compatible with David's non-linear narrative storytelling. If you could find the places where I was, he'd cross a line and it's like, now I'm too lost. Yeah. Or I was really moved or horrified, I would just instinctively build an air there and leave time. I just knew that people would need time to digest that. I was my own lab rat, and
Right.
I was the right kind of lab rat for David.
But what I think is interesting is sometimes when you settle on something for a long time. I just watched A Straight Story yesterday, so this is in my head.
Fresh.
The opening sequence where she's in between these two houses and lying out.
Eating her pink snowballs.
And she's, that you sit, that's to me an establishing shot. That you could do that in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But you don't. You
No.
sit there. Maybe you're establishing in that first shot. This
Right.
is not going to be super fast
It's
moving.
It's also very Lynchian. It was
Yes.
like sending a Lynch signal.
Yes.
And that's the way David shot it. It's not the way we wrote it, but that's the way he shot that scene.
That
And
she's
so-
there for a while.
Yeah.
She gets up.
Yeah.
She's gone for a while.
Yeah.
She comes back.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that's another thing I just love in editing, and I do it all the time, are those kinds of transitions of all, and dissolves and multiple layers of dissolves, double and triple exposing, which that was something I really loved about digital editing, is I could start to get more painterly with the images like that, and you find these incredible happy accidents of how certain dissolves look together. Like one of my favorites is in Mulholland Drive, where Betty and Rita are sitting on the couch. It's the beginning of the movie, and she's discovered Rita in the bathroom, and they're talking about, what happened to you and all this kind of stuff, and they're sitting on the couch, and
They're practically whispering.
and it starts because it goes from driving. I think it's Justin Theroux's character is driving down a palm-lined road in Beverly Hills or something. So it's up at the palms, and they kind of are, leaning together at the top, and it's just driving along like that. And I dissolved into Naomi Watts like this on the couch, and those trees lined up with their elbows like that in this incredibly cinematic way. So I love doing that, and doing that in The Straight Story with all those beautiful aerial shots was just like a playground to me. I just would get lost in trying different stuff, and that is where music and rhythm, and I don't play musical instruments, but my family's musical. We all sang a lot and had a player piano, and my dad used to play the organ, and we'd all literally gather around and sing together when I was a little kid. And I'm very tuned into music, and that's where it comes out for me, is in editing.
I mean, that leads to sort of the question that I ask kind of everybody, one way or the other, and I think it's a question I inherited from my father, who asked everybody he talked to, is it's a question of voice, about where you find and how you find voice, because I think what you're describing it can be sensibility, aesthetic, but it's a voice. It's a personal voice in editing.
Yeah.
You teach this stuff.
Yeah, I do. I don't teach editing. I teach screenwriting. And I teach a class that I created, and this is sort of, my own trying to get that answer, get it for me and help my students at a very earlier stage in their careers get it. I teach this class I designed called Dreams, the Brain, and Storytelling, and it's sort of, I have a neuroscientist come in who's working at the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, and he, gives basically a kind of a 101, this is how the brain works, and then he goes into the kind of research they're doing to try to delve down to, like, where do ideas come from, and how does that work, and how does a musician respond to things, and at this, stage of the game, it's interesting to feel like I'm finally finding out what that is, or figuring out what that is, and that it is a collaborative. When I read my students' screenplays, they're writing features, I teach feature screenwriting, I can hear like a little tuning fork. I can hear a ping when I see something slipped out that if they thought about it, they'd probably edit it out. That was very revealing and very telling about their voice. Because the worst thing that I have to battle with in young writers is them trying, like you are doing when you edit yourself, to hide it, to not reveal themselves, or because everybody's so awkward. When these are young people, and you don't want to reveal that about yourself. I continually have these really great writers who write secondary and tertiary characters with unbelievable depth, and they're so engaging and three-dimensional, and they all circle around the central character who is only defined by their characteristics and how he interacts or she interacts.
And that's
with
a tendency you're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's a tendency I have still, and I have to fight it. And it's hard to speak in your voice, you know.
And to teach voice, I mean, that's, I don't know if you heard the conversation I had with Laurie Moore, but this was the question, how do you sit alone and focus on your own voice and your own writing for half of your life, and then walk into a room and find a way to bring it out in other people, which is kind of where you are right now also.
A little bit, except that what I've discovered is that is my gift. Laurie is a great writer. She's a great writer. And that's a huge gift she's got. I don't have that gift. I'm a very responsible writer. I write like an editor. So that's why the Romanoffs was a really great experience, because that's a collaborative writing team. And that I could see that is a really great path for me to pursue, because I am a really great editor.
Yes.
And I can see and hear the truth, in a voice, in David's voice, in the voices of all of us in the room. Matt Weiner knows, and so does David. They know their own voices very well, but I hear it, and I'm on board with it.
No, I mean, I know that the experience of working on this Matt Weiner show, The Romanoffs, has been a really great thing for you, and also really wrapped in secrecy, or in a certain kind of
Which my work with David always was wrapped in secrecy. So it's an old habit for me, and I'm very comfortable with it. I'm a really private person, and I don't, and also. It was a great lesson I learned from David. It's like, you don't need to explain it. It's going to come out, and everybody can engage in it, and it could be what they want it to be.
Yeah. So after having worked so closely with David, I hear you saying you came into the writer's room on the Romanoffs with a certain very developed skill set of as an editor and as a collaborator, as being able to recognize certain things and help pull them off. But you're also there as a writer.
Yeah. And I wrote one episode. I mean, that's the way. It was so fascinating to be in a writer's room.
Yeah.
That was my first, really fantastic experience. And it was a great experience. And Matt, was able to, he has earned, obviously, the right to do it the way he wants to. And Amazon respected that. And so we had a dedicated writing room with no pre-production going on for 20 weeks. And we wrote these 8 episodes. Yeah.
So you wrote one, but we wrote 8. So you're in the room on the other episodes as well?
Yes. I'm a consulting producer, and I was in the room. There were 8 writers and Matt was in the room with us almost all the time. He explained the whole idea and concept to us, and he had a lot of ideas already for episodes, and he kind of went through those, and it was great, because that was a great introduction and engagement into where his head was. It had been in this story for, I think, a year before, we all assembled in the writing room. And there were some veterans of Mad Men in the writer's room, and so that was really great. There were a lot of new, fresh people for Matt, and for whom Matt was fresh. And there were these Mad Men vets who he, implicitly trusted, and they had great relationships. And so it was a really very wonderful experience. Really fantastic bunch of super smart people and good writers, and working together to kind of break the story and shape the outline, and then the outline would go to one person to leave the room and write the first draft. And I think that I had some particular strong insights to the nature of the kind of offbeat rhythms of one of the episodes, and they decided to give that to me to write. So he and Semi Chellis, who was kind of his, she's an executive producer along with him on the show, and I was, thrilled because I loved that episode.
20 weeks of writing, I mean, that you are living inside the headspace for 20 weeks of that show.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I can't compare it to other writing rooms, and I'm sure some of them were much crazier hours, especially shows that have writing rooms running alongside production. That's a much more intense experience. And Matt was really smart. He didn't want that pressure. He wanted to really focus on these episodes. And he was, he's a very, very smart guy, a brilliant writer, and he really knows television.
How did you know him?
I just met him. We were both on the board of the LA Review of Books. It's a fledgling book review, 5 years old, something like that. And we were both brought onto the board, and they had a photo shoot. They did a big spread in Hollywood Reporter about, the LA Review of Books and Hollywood and this kind of stuff. And that's where I met him, was at the photo shoot. And he knew a lot about my work. And so, and he's a real cinephile. And he, he knows a lot about a lot of things, in films and television, and so much fun to talk to. And we were just, gabbing away. And then we met a couple of times. He had an office, but he was just sort of developing stuff and writing his book. And, so we just had gab sessions that weren't about any particular projects, just about life and art and books and movie and work. When I didn't know anything about the new show, and I was looking at the trades like a month after it was news, and I saw something about it, and I just sent him an email. I said, I hope you'll think about me when you put your staff together. And he said, I already did. I'll call you in January. And he did.
That's an interesting anecdote, that thing about sending the email, recognizing when you want something and understanding how to approach it.
I've never been very good at it. It was just, Matt and I were becoming friends, and I admired his work, and I thought it would be a situation, what I knew about writing rooms, I thought it'd be a situation that I was particularly suited for, and just seemed like, what have I got to lose?
Well, and I think that, and you were right, and he knew it too. I mean,
he knew it before I knew it. That's how smart he is.
Right. But that's the interesting thing. It's like when people talk about, well, how do you network and how do you hustle and how do you, and in this case, it really was a very simple, it sounds like an intuitive thing.
I'm the worst at hustling and networking. I'm a total disaster at it, complete disaster. But that just was the right thing at the right time.
Yeah. When David did Twin Peaks, looking back on it, it seems incredible that was on television at the time.
Oh my God, that first episode that we worked together, the one I edited, where she's gay, and it's like unbelievable that got on TV in 1992. Right. Incredible.
But subsequently, television has really changed, and now you're working with one of the kind of innovative voices in TV. And TV on so many levels is kind of replacing, I don't want to say replacing film, I wonder how you feel if I say that, but it's occupying a similar space in I think people's...
Yeah, it's where people go for their drama, and it's in part because the experience of going to a movie theater and watching a 2-hour movie, people are too restless. People under 40 are too restless for that now, and they're just not as interested in them. It's not that movies have really gotten worse. What's happened is that to try to keep audiences, studio movies have gotten worse. Yeah. They're all the giant tentpole movies that are just totally dependent on, increasingly amped up action sequences and special effects. And so it's become an old person's pleasure to go to the movie theater. I hope the pendulum, Michael Mann seems to think the pendulum will swing back from his lips to God's ears. But I think that the increased interest in television and the increased, along with the changing platforms and the budgets that are going into television, and the fact that writers are the people who dominate television. It's not a director's game. It's a writer's game. And they are the executive producers. They are the kings and queens in television.
That's interesting.
That's why TV's gotten so much better, is because the writers are doing it. But they're also getting very good directors to do it. But directors have to work according to the design of the writer, and that's a different kind of director also.
The inmates are taking over the asylum here a little bit.
But I do think that that's why things like The Wire and Sopranos, those are like really creative showrunner writers who have been given liberty thanks to first cable and now, digital, and the insane amount of money that there is.
What is a budget on an episode of one of these larger...
I don't know per episode, but I've seen everything from $50 to $70 million is what Amazon has publicly claimed that they're paying for the series, the 8-episode series. Right. And Matt directed all of them. I was on the set of my episode. I can't say where. It was in Europe, and it was like a big movie. It was
like a movie. Right, well, it's not far from your Straight Story budget at that point.
Yeah, if you divide it that way. But I don't know what the actual budget of each show was. But I'm just saying it was he was really knocking it out of the park. Yeah. I can't wait to see it.
So, Mary, when I asked you if you would do this, you said, I'll talk about anything, and then you gave me a list of things. So I'm going to put a couple of words in front of you right now.
And none of them was, when did you fall in love with David Lynch, if I recall correctly.
I didn't mean, the question was not, I understand when I asked that question, the reason I think that you responded is, I wasn't trying to unpack any personal thing about like the timeline of marriages and relationships. It was more evolution of a working relationship and a personal relationship at the same time.
It is the only time I have had a personal relationship with anybody, and I've been working since I was 15. And, it was in large part against my better instincts, and I really resisted it for quite a while. But it was, it was great.
I grew up in a house where both of my parents are extremely creative. And they were complementary to each other in what they did, but they were not working together on the same stuff.
I can't believe it myself when I look back on it.
I envy often. I have seen couple friends, not maybe quite as in lockstep, although sometimes musical friends or complementary artistic friends, and there's an energy that starts to be generated that is so infectious, and it inspires everybody involved. And I really look at that with a kind of longing sometimes. And on the other hand, I feel like the healthiest thing in my life has been that there's this real separation of these things.
It's fraught with problems yet to come, but we had a great long ride.
Yes.
It really worked out for a long time. And I'm really, I have zero regrets, of course.
Okay,
What's my list?
Here's your list. Baking pies.
Wait, you're going to give me these one by one and I have to. Okay, so I have become a master pie baker, which, your parents have benefited from quite a bit.
Yes.
And all my friends in my family here. And basically, someone long ago when I lived in New York, a very sophisticated woman, taught me how to make pâté brisé. The secret is butter. It's flour and butter, but it's something that, commercially you don't seem to be able to get anymore, is that kind of pie with that kind of crust. And the sweetest thing about it is that the first Thanksgiving I came home after that, I baked this pie for my father, who was raised on a dairy farm, and they churned their own butter, etc. He was born on that farm. And he almost started crying when I made that pie for him. It just instantly gave rise to many childhood memories. And so that became my, specialty.
So pies, baking, as I understand, I'm not a baker, but as I understand it, baking, where you have a lot of people who are great in the kitchen, they cook and they improvise. You don't get to do a lot of improvising when you're baking.
No, and it often breaks down. People are either good bakers or good chefs.
And you?
Everybody in my family were my grandmas, my mom, were all baking cookies and breads and stuff like that. I think it maybe comes out of the farm. Life. I like to cook, but I'm not a great baker. I'm a great pie maker.
Pie maker.
Yeah.
Cairo.
Okay, so I have been involved both through USC and Film Independent, where I'm board chair, with State Department grants to be a sort of soft diplomacy internationally through the arts. I was involved with the project investigators when we got the grant, and I made certain contributions, including bringing Film Independent on as a sponsor to the USC grant application. And then I've traveled, once we got the grant, it sent filmmakers and film experts to foreign countries with certain films that seemed appropriate in some way, and we'd have a week of exchanges with film students or students who weren't film students, and we'd show the films and this kind of stuff. So that was filmmakers going over and sort of
with finished films, just
finished
showing
films.
films.
So we
and
took the straight story to, of all places, Kazakhstan. And I went to Kazakhstan on that. And then I went to Laos with some other films. And I was a film expert on that. And I'm on the roster of film experts for that grant program. And I went to Jordan also and did a couple weeks of workshops on producing, editing, writing films. And then Film Independent applied for a grant that was bringing filmmakers over and creating several weeks of programs in Los Angeles to put them through. Filmmakers sort of mid-range, already had made films and that sort of thing, all from the Middle East. And
this was when?
That was about 3 years ago. So it was
post-Arab Spring.
I was then mentoring, mostly screenwriting, with the filmmakers who came over as those workshops. So then I went to Cairo in 2016 on the USC grant program, and I was on the jury of the Cairo Film Festival. And the previous spring on the Film Independent program, I had mentored an Egyptian filmmaker, and when I went to Cairo the following December, I saw 45 minutes of that film that I mentored him for the screenplay of. And then that film was subsequently Egypt's official submission to the Academy Awards. So that kind of stuff is happening. Now I'm going back to Cairo in December, again at the time of the Cairo Film Festival, not on the jury, and we're going to have a meeting of all of the Middle Eastern filmmakers that we've worked with over the past 3 years in these workshops.
As you started to set this up, there was a phrase that you used that I think is so interesting, soft diplomacy.
Yeah. Everybody thinks I'm in the CIA. I am not in the CIA.
Well,
I really am a filmmaker, just like wanting to keep lines of communication open.
I think it's fair to say, to an extent, in a slightly more abstract way, that when we do work, we are engaged in the art of soft diplomacy in the sense that this is the sort of the best export that we maybe have to much of the world, our ability to create the way that we can. And I often think when I perform in certain places with my father that we are kind of diplomats in a funny way.
Absolutely. No, I've always believed that, and I love this country, warts and all.
Yes.
And I think that there are many things that people admire, about us. And I think the world is heartbroken that seems to be turned on its head right now. I think we've done many heinous things in the 20th and 21st century, long before President Trump.
That's true.
And there are many reasons why people don't, hold us up as a leading light. But nevertheless, it's a great country to live in, and we do have a lot of freedoms. Hopefully,
and
that'll
creative
continue.
freedoms. At least so far, creative freedoms are not on the chopping block. I mean, the press is in the sights, and that's not good.
No.
Because right after that comes the writers.
Yeah.
But I still feel like, well, we're still making what we need to make.
Yeah, and it is. It puts a human face, especially now. It puts a human face on what Americans are like for artists, musicians, painters, filmmakers. The other soft diplomacy programs. There's a music program where they send young black women rappers over to Africa, and it's a great program, and it started many, many years ago, and maybe some people are in the CIA who are in it, but I don't know anybody. I mean, because we're all people here with real jobs, and
Although I don't know if I can trust you because everything you've done has been enshrouded in secrecy. So if you were in the CIA, the last thing you would do is say you're in the CIA.
Exactly. That's exactly what they'd expect me to say.
Okay, parenting, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to. I will ask this. You have a son. He's a product of two very creative people. He is a creative person himself. What did you hope that he would see from you guys?
Once again, that involves an ego that I don't have. I have an ego. I'm not, trying to put myself to be, something
Egoless,
I'm not.
yes.
But, I took it one step at a time, and I was so happy to have a child. I kind of squeaked it in under the wire, and we were such a happy little family for so many years. And as I say, we sort of pulled in Austin and Jennifer Lynch as well, because they were both living, after a while, they were both living in LA, and we had Sunday dinners every week, and it was really so fantastic. And I loved being a mother, and I loved my son, and he, when I came into my family, I don't know why I came in different from everybody else, but I came in who I was, and he came in who he was. And as he grew older, life with Riley was discovering who Riley was, which was different from David and different from me and part David. And that's the way I still look at him. I see ways in which he's like me and ways in which he's like David and ways in which he's not anything like either of us. But he is a very creative guy with really, by the way, the way we talk about being perceptive and being able to find the gold in material and know when something was right. That's another thing, David's really good at that, and Riley is really good at that, and that is, in filmmaking, really critical.
But one thing that Riley had sort of going for him that you didn't is that he didn't have to explain to you or to his father that he was interested in being an artist or why he, that was just part of who he was growing up.
Part of me wished he wanted to be an accountant just to spare him the grief of being the child of, artists. But he really focused on music. He's a musician, and he fairly assiduously avoided film all the way into like the second year of college. And then he gave up and went to the Art Institute, transferred from where he'd been going to college, and transferred to the Art Institute and only focused on film and made some really interesting films there. So that's the path he's on now.
Finally, and I'm saving, I do feel the best for last because you did, the Catholic Church, Mary Sweeney. What is there to say?
I have been thinking a lot about my own storytelling. And, I mentioned earlier that I will never be a writer even approaching the caliber of somebody like Lori Moore, but I do like to write, and it's become an increasingly important part of my artistic endeavors. And I realized that my passion, which is what I had as a child, for everything about, when I was growing up, it was still in Latin, and I was, in grade school during the Vatican II and all those changes. And I really regretted those changes, even as a, little shaver. It's like, ew, I don't want to hear this in English. It's so much more beautiful in Latin. But I was very, went to Catholic schools, and my Catholic schools had nuns who were genuinely like angels, with a few exceptions. A music teacher who was just full of light and joy and, sweetness. And really, most of the nuns in the Dominican order that I experienced were like that. And the Dominicans' mission is education. It's not like, conversion or things like that. Many of the nuns were well educated because their order would pay for, advanced degrees for the nuns and things like that. And they lived in this liberal town. And as you know, there's a whole wide swath of certainly nuns and some priests like Thomas Merton, and hopefully this Pope, who they take the mission seriously, that everybody is your brother and sister and that we're here to serve the poor and help the needy and all that kind of stuff. I believed all of that up until about 16 or 17. And I had the, protection and the fortune to be taught by religious people, mostly nuns, who really lived that way. But the mythology completely captured my imagination. And I would we would every Friday during Lent, we'd go leave the classroom as a class and go over and do the Stations of the Cross. Like every grade would have their turn. We'd do this kind of thing. And I would stand before every one of the stations and just totally immerse myself in what Jesus felt like. This kind of thing. It was a very immersive thing for me and triggered my imagination, and was a very famous story that I could learn the rhythms of storytelling from. So I've come to realize that one of the many gifts, along with a kind of sense of morality, or not morality, kind of justice, that the Catholic Church gave me, was a deep mythology to enrich my childhood with storytelling. And so I'm not interested in telling Bible stories, but I have a deep internal, that's the way the brain works. It's nurture and nature.
In a funny way, there's almost something Lynchian about it. Like, I have to say, I grew up Jewish. I don't understand the story of Jesus. I keep asking my friends who were raised, with it, to explain to me again. I don't. And in the resurrection, how does it mean, and where? It's so foreign to me. But it's obviously an extremely compelling story.
Yeah, and it's very mystical.
And it's mystical.
Okay,
yes.
The Holy Trinity. Let's just start there.
Yes.
It's unbelievable to believe in these things as a child.
It is
triggers your imagination.
That's that. In a funny way, I've been kind of trying to figure out, why is this story so sticky? Because it requires us to accept things that we really don't know how to accept. But as you say, as a child...
Coming back to why I'm a good editor for David.
Yes.
I didn't need to know what the mystery was all about.
Yes. But you accepted that there is mystery. You accepted that...
I embrace mystery. I love mystery.
Yes.
And it's probably out of that. It was where my imagination could go.
Yes. How much of that did you provide to your son when he was growing up?
Here's the sum total.
Yeah.
I had him baptized just in case I'm wrong about everything I've decided as an adult.
Yes.
And that was pretty funny. I had a very hard time finding a priest who would do it because we weren't married at the time. And we found this great priest at St. Francis Xavier, 16th Street in the Village, and had a big party. It was a lot of fun. But he was 6 months old by then.
In New York, you can always find a priest who will...
he wore cowboy boots. He baptized my, bastard.
Mary Sweeney, thank you for taking this morning with me.
Thank you, Leo Sidran.
This has
fun.
been great.
Yeah, very
really
fun.
Great.
There it was. My conversation with Mary Sweeney. At the end, I have to say, we should have told people before the conversation started to hang in there till the end, because it gets juicy at the end, especially because we wrapped up by talking about the Catholic Church. If I had been a heavy-handed editor this week, I might have put the Catholic Church business up in front. But she told me not to. She told me not to touch it too much, so I let it roll. and you had to hang in there. So thank you, my friends, for hanging in. Amanda, thank you for hanging in with me.
Always.
I'll be back sometime soon with another great episode. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.
Can't wait.